Oh, okay. There's a recording in progress. Um, at the University of Cologne, where he studied philosophy and theology, he was introduced to the works of Pseudo Dionysius, who was to have such a great effect on his own thought. Um, if you're Most of you are probably familiar with Dionysius. He's an anonymous author of a number of mystical, very Neoplatonic texts. Um, he called himself Dionysius, uh, this sort of ancient or medieval tradition of naming yourself after somebody famous, usually in the Bible. In this case, after the figure who was on the Areopagus when St. Paul was converted. Naming himself a first century figure, but we think probably Dionysius actually lived in the 5th or 6th century and was possibly a Syrian monk. So somebody much later, um, but a thoroughgoing Neoplatonist who is quoted by St. Thomas as well, but had a huge impact on Nicholas of Cusa. So Cusanus was ordained to the priesthood in the 1430s and participated in the Council of Basel. His advocacy of conciliarism um, is found in his text De Concordantia Catholica on universal harmony. And in this case, when he wrote that and when he was at that council, he was representing a German figure, Ulrich of Mannheim or something like that, who obviously had a vested interest in not having the Pope have all the power. And so Nicholas of Cusa was on his side, but later he switched. Um, he wrote everything from epistemological treatises like De Conjecturis on conjectures, to mystical works, to commentaries on other religions like De Pace Fide, on the peace of faith. His mystical work, Divisione Dei, if you're ever to sit down and read Nicholas of Cusa, I mean, he's fascinating to read. I would recommend sections of On Learned Ignorance, which is his most famous text, and Divisione Dei on the mystical vision, because both of those are just really beautiful. But he also had more purely philosophical dialogues like De Deo Abscondito and the Idiota, which was a defense against misinterpretation. And I was, when I was writing my book, quite interested in his book, De Filiatione Dei, on the sonship of God, which is about his concept of deification or theosis. The idea is sort of at the end of time, you are incorporated into God. You become truly united with the divine. This is a theme in Neoplatonic Christian theology. Sometimes the human being disappears completely into the divine, and sometimes there's some sort of identity retained. But it's really a different vision than the idea that we're all human beings and then we die, and then there's a divine being that takes us still as independent individual beings up into heaven, where we sort of live forever with God as individuals. Right. So I was quite interested in that. I kind of traced his debts to Pseudo Dionysius, Maximus Confessor, Gregory of Nyssa, and I was interested in unpacking what that means for creation. Like, what sort of a picture do you have of creation? if deification is salvation. Um, if you have the sort of traditional Western scholastic, I guess, picture of salvation, where we still retain our our individuality and go up to heaven, um, then creation is a god up there on a blue Monday deciding to create human beings as separate things than God's self. But if salvation is theosis, sort of a re-deifying of human beings that originally came from God's very self, then creation is something very different. It's divine self-manifestation. It is this a notion of unfolding that we find in Nicholas of Cusa's work. Um, so I was interested in looking at what a creation is, and then looking at what sort of existence is, living is, um, which is then a very mystical thing where the divine presence is sort of enlivens us and gives us life. And then at the end of time, we return to God. Um, Nicholas of Cusa, he's Neoplatonic in the sense that he's placing God beyond rational thought. I mean, thinking, discursive language can only take us so far. When Plato spoke of the good, Plato was referring to something that was beyond the world of the forms. It was the form of form, something on a completely different level. And that is how Nicholas of Cusa sees God. There's no analogy possible between anything in the created order, human beings or anything like that, and God. You can't sort of use the word like when you're talking about God. That means that knowing God is a project that requires a sort of mystical leap, enlightenment, rather than rationality. Nicholas is always showing how rational thought will get us to a certain point, and then rational thought sort of turns back against itself, and only when you know that you don't know, right? Didacta ignorantia. His most famous text on learned ignorance, where in a sense we can't know God, but knowing that we don't know is a progress. You know, your classic apophatic or negative theology. So thanks, Julia. She's got one of my slides up here. This is from chapter 2 of Learned Ignorance. All of Nicholas's work is, by the way, translated in easily findable online. You can search for it by title, or I think really the best translator is a man named Jasper Hopkins. Don't read his commentary, but his translations are wonderful. It says, now when the things investigated are able to be compared by means of a close proportional tracing back to what is taken to be certain, our judgment apprehends easily. But when we need many intermediate steps, difficulty arises and hard work is required. These points are recognized in mathematics, where the earlier propositions are quite easily traced back to the first and most evident principles, but where later propositions are traced back with more difficulty because they are traced back only through the mediation of the earlier ones. Therefore, every inquiry proceeds by means of a comparative relation, whether an easy or a difficult one. Hence, the infinite, qua infinite, is unknown, for it escapes all comparative relation. So we're able to know new things in comparison to the old things that we already know. If you I had the opportunity of going to Singapore a few years ago, and the national fruit is a durian, these just absolutely horrible tasting large fruits that they won't let in restaurants or hotels or airplanes, certainly, because they smell so horrible. One little piece can make a whole building stink. So the Singaporeans entertain themselves by feeding this stuff to unsuspecting tourists like me. And I was only able to describe it by referring to what it tastes like by to other things that I know. And in this case, I said it tastes like mango poo. Um, it was really horrible. So we have to compare things. But in the case of the divine, there is no comparison. There's no infinity in sort of this world, and so comparisons don't work. Um, Nicholas is so he's trying to get at this paradox between the transcendent God, who is completely infinite and unknowable, and sort of beyond all things, and the immanent God. God is both transcendent and completely present and infiltrating everything and everyone at the same time. I think the easiest way to think about this is if you have sort of the scholastic tradition that employs analogy, in the hierarchy of being and things like that. Nicholas is the opposite to that. He's able to hold two opposing positions at the same time, that God is transcendent and immanent. And it is actually very important that he maintain that paradox. If the divine is only transcendent, then there's no way of knowing anything about God. It's a waste of time, and we lapse into atheism. If God is completely present, immanent, in all things, completely, such that there is no aspect of God that extends beyond the world in a panentheistic way, then we have pantheism, which is also obviously not going to be acceptable to Nicholas or anybody of that time. So he's very careful in his text to sketch all this out, and I think the evidence that he was successful in maintaining these paradoxes is not in whether or not he had direct followers, but in the fact that he was never beheaded or condemned or exiled from the church, like people like Meister Eckhart and Giordano Bruno and other people who are saying some of these very similar things. He was a cardinal for many years and was never thrown out. So let's see. So I basically am suggesting that Nicholas is not searching for any sort of traditional knowledge about God. He's presenting us with the possibility of paradoxical wisdom about God that supersedes mere knowledge. Oh yeah. You can go back one, Julie, and I'll tell you about the icon. So this is from his text that we call the mystical vision. The direct translation is the vision of God, of course. But he writes this entire book to the monks, the brothers, in a town called Brixen, where he was the priest. So this is fairly early in his career. And these monks were asking him questions. He eventually moves on and is thinking about them and writes this treatise to answer their questions. How can we know God, right? The metaphor that he uses here, he asks us to, and I think in the, along with the book, he includes a note that he's sending them one of these pictures. But we have to imagine one of these portraits where the eyes follow the viewer, no matter where the viewer goes. So this is the icon. So here he says, if I strive in human fashion to transport you to things divine, I must use a comparison of some kind. Now, among human works, I have found no image better suited to our purpose than that of an image which is omnivoyant, made to appear as though looking upon all around it. I'm sending to you a painting that I was able to acquire. It contains the figure of an omnivoyant individual, and I call it the icon of God. To my knowledge, this thing does not exist anymore. We don't know whatever happened to it. And he instructs them, hang this icon somewhere on the north wall, and you brothers stand around it at a short distance from it and observe it. Regardless of the place from which each of you looks at it, each will have the impression that he alone is being looked at by it. To the brother who is situated in the east, it will seem that the face is looking toward the east. To the brother in the south, that the face is looking toward the south. To the brother in the west, that it is looking westward. And I'll get a bit more. Moreover, if while fixing his sight upon the icon, he walks from west to east, he will find that the icon's gaze proceeds continually with him. And if he returns from east to west, the gaze will likewise not desert him. He will marvel at how the icon's gaze is moved immovably. And while he considers that this gaze does not desert anyone, he sees how diligently it is concerned for each one, as if it were concerned for no one else, but only for him who experiences that he is seen by it. So this is the divine, creative, constituting, like being constituting gaze of God. Nicholas sees creation as an unfolding of God's very self, a self manifestation of the divine. In much the same way that, when we think about painters, we think about the things that they painted. Picasso would not be Picasso if Picasso painted Monet's paintings. There is an expression of the self of the creator there. And so certainly that happens at the beginning of time, but he's also interested in our present existence and the divine presence that makes up each human being at any given time. He talks a lot in Division a Day about the sense in which he imagines that, so each of us, we're all looking at the icon, like we're standing around looking at the icon. We are mirrors of it. We are reflections, not perfect reflections. We can't be perfect reflections of the divine, or we would be the divine ourselves. But we're sort of limited perfections of God. And so that's one of these really wonderful metaphors that he uses. So he uses others. I mean, I can tell you about Depossessed and other things, but I'm not sure how much you want me to talk, Julia, or you want to chime in here? Oh dear, I'm not good at lip reading.
Right. Okay. Yes. Sorry about that. Yes, I find Nicholas Cusano is absolutely fascinating. His sense of the paradoxes, the concordance of things which are discordant, and so forth, and the ways in which he uses this for a theology, which is also at the time of Bessarion, that's inclusive instead of exclusive, that's ecumenical.
Yes.
And but I do have serious problems with the whole pseudo Dionysian thread in this tapestry in our culture, which Julian of Norwich rejects, because
Oh,
pseudo Dionysius is for hierarchies and
oh well, yes.
is for even Christian.
Right,
And
right.
Adam Easton, who is probably Julian's spiritual director,
Mhm.
owns a copy of Pseudo Dionysus, a beautiful manuscript with this wonderful for the invocation to the Trinity,
Oh, okay.
beautiful intertwined Gothic tea, which I
Hmm.
think Julian has seen because it gets copied into her manuscripts, the use of that tea. But
Wow.
at the same time, it's sort of a love-hate relationship. And but I find what is interesting about Nicholas of Cusa is he doesn't take on the negative aspects of Pseudo-Dionysius, but he does explore those which are absolutely fascinating, the finding God in the darkness and so on.
Yeah, the mystery. Yes,
And I sort of feel that it had already, Meister Eckhart was already doing this kind of theology,
absolutely.
and the Friends of God were there in that became the Brethren of the Common Life,
Yeah,
with which Cusa has contact. At the same time, Cusa has gone to Constantinople before the
right.
fall, which
And
is
and
the
he's seen the
so
Ottoman at
instead of the Aristotelian world of the Paris
right,
University of the Sorbonne and so on, you've got this other opposite world of Platonism,
right.
which is, it's interesting that the women contemplatives were, uh, there's this wonderful, I'm trying to remember her name, the one who gets burned in 1310 at the stake.
Marguerite Porete?
Yes, Marguerite Porete. She absorbs this kind of Platonic
Yeah,
theology.
yeah, yeah.
And her text is actually translated into Middle English in the same manuscript as Julian of Norwich's Showing of Love in the short version, as
Wow.
well as other texts, for instance, Jan van Roosbroek, that whole
Okay. Yeah,
circle of the Friends of God, and so on. So then Nicholas of Cusa comes into this strand, this tapestry later, but he does exemplify something which is really splendid. And his openness, although he is a bit anti Semitic,
yeah. That does come through. Yeah,
Jews wear badges and
yeah,
so on. But
exactly.
he studies the Quran, he studies these other peoples of the book to see how they can be reconciled.
Right, right.
And I do find, the church has so many problems
Even cool.
and corruptions and so on and so forth. But then you get these learned men who are struggling to create a theology which is peaceable and inclusive.
Right, right.
So you go through Adam Easton and Bessarion
Yeah,
and Cusa. But
yeah.
also there's something else here, which I'll see if we can get to it. Um, here again. I'm trying to turn to the next slide, but it's not wanting to do that.
Hmm.
There.
Oh, then I'll leave it. Yeah, yeah. I
Right.
love. Yeah.
Humans or the self. There's the other, God, not other. And
Mm.
then squaring of the circle, which is an aspect he takes on.
Right.
And this is back in the Greek world, Archimedes and so on and so forth. And then in Brunetta Latina, you have this extraordinary image. If you've got a hole through the world and you drop a stone, it will get stuck at the center like Lucifer in Dante's Inferno because of gravity before Newton and the apple falling on his head and so on and
Right.
so forth. But then you also have, from Robert Gross' test, you have Brunetta talking about squaring the circle and saying that actually the circle is a better form than the square. It holds more and
Huh.
so forth. But the modern mathematicians say it is not possible to square the circle. That it's and so on. But I found it fascinating that this is actually something which gets into Nicholas of Cusa's theology. And I've just come from a talk on three people speaking on Dante in Palazzo Vecchio. One of them said, look, the earth is the square and the heavens are the circle. But actually, I don't see squares in Dante. I see circles even in hell and so on. But now let's everyone unmute and everyone join in the discussion. And so I think everyone can do that. And there's some people whom I can't see. Let's maybe if I go on to the end, right? Okay. And there's gallery view. And I'm not finding where my gallery view is. Oh, let's see. If, right. Okay. Let's get out of this. And sorry. Okay. Now we're seeing people. Uh, Right. Angela Carmela, Anne Barbetti, Anya Lang, Alex Johnson, Sue Miner, and anyone else? Have we 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
There's
7?
somebody.
There's
Fine.
7 of us, right? Which is a celestial number, the number of the planets. So Anna, we can all unmute now, and let's see. Okay. I think if you'll need to, Angela. Angela, do you have some comments?
Not yet. I'd like to, this is wonderful, but this is very new to me, so I'd love to hear from others first. Well, actually, here's one question. With respect to transcendent and immanent, just that's so fascinating. Um, for someone like me, this is not my field. So would it be possible to contextualize that a little bit more so that I can understand what was
Right.
particularly radical about?
Nancy,
Oh yeah, because really radical.
yes.
Yeah, no worries. Do you want to talk about that, Julia, or do you want me to talk about that?
I want Nancy to talk about this.
Okay. Well, so transcendence generally refers in theology to something being beyond our ability to experience it or, have anything to say about it, really, right? And then immanence is this notion of divine presence. In the most of Christianity, so Western Christianity, scholasticism, all the Thomas Aquinas stuff, the dominant stuff that comes out of Christian theology all the way through the Middle Ages is tends to see God as the top of the hierarchy of being, which is a concept that we get from Aristotle, right? So all we have to do, like we can talk, I mean, they would say, because obviously I'm a Neoplatonist and not one of them, but I'm on the losing side in history. But they would say that if you can just, like you can say that God is good, for example, if we can just define goodness most as specifically as possible. So even Christian theologians today, like there are whole conferences that I don't go to because to me they're like splitting hairs and still trying to analyze Christian philosophy, right? In especially a lot of like it's a proof for the existence of God. So somebody like my teacher, Nick Waltersdorf, or the guy at Calvin who I heard speak, who I can't remember his name, but they're still trying to use Thomas Aquinas as proofs for the existence of God,
Mhm.
right? Because God is provable. You just take those logical steps up there, right? And this, I mean, all the Neoplatonists are sitting there saying, what? We're trying to talk about something that is completely different, right? So in order to be able to say we have to be able to say something, because as human beings, we're driven to talk about God. Nicholas of Cusa is incredible. He basically says, we can't talk about God. And then he talks about God in 14 books, right? So we're driven to speak. And so the only language to employ that's absolutely correct is paradoxical language, where you say God is good, and this is pseudo Dionysius, and God is not good, and God is not good, because our definitions of goodness are all human based, right? So the trick is to hold those. And people like Meister Eckhart were trying to do this as well. I mean, he was condemned by the church, and we have a lot of, certainly there is a Neoplatonic thread that runs all through Christian theology, but it's eclipsed by scholasticism and the analogy stuff.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, I mean,
Yes.
as a philosopher of religion, everybody says, oh, you know Thomas Aquinas. Of course, you know Thomas Aquinas. Well, yeah, but it doesn't stick in my head because to me, it's like, it doesn't make any sense.
Right. To go back to Thomas Aquinas, he quotes Pseudo Dionysius a
He does too,
thousand times.
thousands.
And Pseudo Dionysius is
Mm.
he's false news, he's fake news. Uh, he pretends he's an eyewitness of the
Right.
crucifixion,
But
that
we don't,
he is there and converted by Paul
I
on
see.
Mount Areopagus, when he lives in Syria several centuries later. And he
But
creates this wonderful fiction. And it's
yeah,
gorgeous stuff to read. I mean,
yeah.
you do find yourself enormously attracted to it, but it's all a lie.
but
And it,
that wasn't, he wasn't doing it to fake people out, and it wasn't even there was a kind of tradition where you felt that you were kind of like channeling
yes,
Dionysius
it
the
was
Areopagite.
more Buddhism than Christianity in a strange way.
Right.
And what's fascinating is that it was extremely convenient for the emperors of Constantinople because of the argument about hierarchies. The gospel is against hierarchies. The Magnificat is the opposite of hierarchies. Christianity is not about hierarchies, but the church is.
And
And this is uh, forged by Pseudo Dionysius. And then the emperors of Constantinople kept giving copies of Pseudo Dionysius' writings to the kings of France and so forth. And this caused actually the birth of Gothic architecture at Saint Denis, which is the church dedicated to St. Dionysius, because the story gets even more fake. Saint Denis Dionysius is supposed to have shown up in Paris and to have been beheaded and to have walked up the hill of Montparnasse to Sacre Coeur holding his head. He's one of these head carrying saints like our San Miniato here in
that's
Florence.
talent.
But this became so sacred, and when Abelard realized that he was a fake, he was bitterly punished by his order of Saint Denis, because all of the sort of royal hierarchy, there's another person wanted to come in, all of the hierarchy was based on Pseudo Dionysius, who was creating something which was very opposite to Christianity. And at the same time, though, I find that what Nicholas of Cusa does with it is positive instead of negative,
Yeah, yeah. I
if
would,
that makes sense.
because Nicholas is not, he doesn't have those Neoplatonic levels between God and the created order. There's only two levels. And which one are you going to have on top? I mean, not humans.
The enfolding and so forth, which is very much like Julian's even Christian.
Right. And I think that the other thing that saves him is not just that he cuts out all those middle hierarchical levels, but also that the sense of divine presence is so strong. He's so mystical. You know, he really preserves that.
Yes. Anya, do you have comments? Anya?
Oops.
Yes.
I know very little about this topic, but I found the references to art and creation extremely interesting. The connection to what you were reading about the icon, and you don't know which icon it was.
No, as far as I know, we have never seen it. We don't know what one it is. Or was. Yeah.
You know,
It would
that
be really,
business of the, my grandfather was a painter. And as a child, I was fascinated. He had painted the portrait of a great aunt. And there she was with her violin on this landing. So you would walk across the room and her eyes would follow you. And it's a trick where if you paint having the sitter look into your eyes, the eyes in the painting will follow you wherever you go, which is what Nicholas of Cusa is describing with the figure of the icon. And remember Bessarion with his icon
Right,
in
right.
the Bellini painting, which is fascinating because it's the
Yeah,
mixture of the Orthodox world and the Catholic world just sort of juxtaposed suddenly together,
yeah,
as in the declaration that Bessarion gave in the Duomo just after it was completed,
right,
uh,
right,
in joining the two churches. It
right. I
only
mean,
lasted a brief
yeah,
time because when he got back to Constantinople, it was rejected by the delegates had gone ahead, but they didn't have the support of the church back in Istanbul.
right. And
So
then,
Istanbul became Muslim instead.
yeah,
History.
the divine
Um,
presence in art is so fascinating. I remember in Dante's Inferno, right? Dante refers to art as God's grandchild.
yes.
And I was thinking of those lines when Nancy was
Yes.
talking about that. Yeah.
That is lovely. Yes.
Mhm.
I just have to chime in. I absolutely agree.
Mhm.
First of all, wonderful, Nancy. Thank you. And Julia, as always. Um, this idea of how it relates to art, I think, is absolutely fascinating. And his whole paradoxes makes me think of a couple things. That I was recently reading something that Thomas Merton wrote in his journal, not too long before he died, which is, and he's in Asia, and he's has all of a sudden this sort of mystical experience where he understands that all his life and certainly his training as a Catholic has been kind of either yes, no, and how exhausted he's been by that, and that everything is a refutation, when in fact he understands that there are no paradoxes, that there is a kind of circle, if you will. And I just have this question about, which I thought was so elegant. Is this Nicholas self the other, God not the other, or is that a paraphrasing that you're taking?
okay, so one of his books, in every book, as I mentioned, he uses a different word for God. And in the entire book, he won't use the word God. He'll just use this wacky phrase he's invented, right? It's always something Latin, of course. but the translator leaves it in Latin, right? So one of his books is called De Non Aliud, on God as not other, with the N capitalized. So God is named not other.
Oh,
And that kind of plays with your mind, right? God is, I mean, in the first place, if you're setting about in the world, like starting from zero and you're starting at let's name things, right? Then we're going to name the source of all things first, right? Like we're going to name God first, okay? But I don't have a name for God. God's completely mysterious and transcendent. So all I can do is start with myself and saying, I'm going to call myself other, and I'm going to call God not other, right? So if God is not other, that has a dual meaning. God is not me, but God is not different, not other
Mhm.
than me in the world too, right?
I,
There's got the paradox right there in the name.
I just think it's the most elegant, elegant,
Yeah.
elegant,
Mm,
profound
yeah.
metaphysical concept when we look at the self as the other and God as not the other. I just think it is stunning.
And Julie's whole thing of othering, and I mean, here we hear,
Right. And wanting.
yeah. So another really beautiful metaphor he has, and then I'll shut up, is he talks about God as the sphere whose center is everywhere,
Mhm.
circumference is nowhere.
Which goes right back to Boethius too, where God is the center. And the farther we go from God, the less we are. The
Right.
more we enfold into God, using Cusa's term, the
Right.
more we are, God is, and so forth. I'm wondering, Anne Babetti, do you have something to add?
Quite off the subject, but when you were talking about
I can't hear you.
this, I don't know whether you can't hear me.
I can hear you.
Just,
You
yes.
can.
Mhm.
No, I want. You brought to my mind the Quakers when they say the inner light, and
Right.
that sort of sums up things. It makes it much simpler.
Mhm.
It's very affirming. And when when I was a young whippersnapper and first studying this stuff, my heart's desire was to sort of co-opt Nicholas of Cusa for a Christian environmental ethic, right? Because at the time, the only person who was doing that stuff was Sally McFagg, and she was writing things like, just sort of looking in the Bible for all these little bits and pieces. Oh, God is a hen with his chicks. Oh, God is this, like this verse and that verse. And I'm like, we have this in the tradition already. Why are we not using this in a more like already developed way, right? And I never did write that book.
Ah, right. Yaroslav, do you have something to add? Do you want to unmute?
So
Right.
I unfortunately I have joined this meeting very late, and I lost whole your conversation. Yes, but of course I had some ideas, but I just don't know your context today.
Thank you
Just
for your presence. Right. And
this just little mess with time zones. I just forgot where is when in Italy. Is it 20 hours? Um, and that's why I'm so late today.
What time is it where you are?
right.
Julia, you mentioned Buddhism earlier. Why did that come to your mind? Because I was thinking more of Taoism, where the presence
Right.
of the divine
Yes,
is in
you are the
everything,
expert.
and the nothing is
Yes.
everything. And
Right.
mhm.
My sense was that where pseudo-Dionysus is coming from has more the aspect of nirvana, Indian mysticism, uh, travel routes, trade routes from Syria. It's not the incarnational theology of the Gospels. It's and also Platonism and Neoplatonism has this abstractness. What I found fascinating when I was studying Hebrew and Greek is that Greek tends to be quite abstract and philosophical, whereas Hebrew is very concrete. Um, when they're trying to describe God in the Bible, he's got all these human parts. He's got hands, he's got a backside, everything. He has a body, even though he's never to be represented as a body, only with the hand. And you can't even use the number of the fingers of the hand because it's so sacred that you have to leave that blank and give the other numbers instead. But there's a sense of, I found it's a very concrete language, a very down to earth one, whereas Greek was sort of spiraling off into the heavens. And when the word for man in Hebrew is Adam, whereas in Greek it just sort of, when Jesus says, I am the Son of Man, he doesn't say I'm the Son of God. He's saying Ben Adam, but that doesn't come through in the Greek translation of the gospel. It just becomes sort of, sort of vague. And it isn't vague in the Hebraic or Aramaic languages. I'm wondering, we need to think about what will be our next topic. I jumped the gun and I did one Bessarion9 on the Brunetta Latina book, which is now published. But what should we do for Bessarion11, August, the first Tuesday in August? Does anyone have a topic they would like to bring up? Anne, would you be available to talk about the vestments for John the Baptist?
Well, I'm not sure because until I get it into the hands of the publisher,
Okay,
it seems
so we can do that
changing.
later when you would be, because in Italy everyone
Yeah.
goes away in August. The
And,
whole country
yes.
goes dead. You can't do anything. And,
No,
so
I'm anxious to tell people about this because
I
it's a
can't
different
hear
way
you.
of looking at these vestments.
I,
But I think I'll have to wait until at least gets
okay,
into the hand
right.
of the publisher.
Would it be all right if then August 1, I do it on the work I was doing with Julian Jaynes on his book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind.
Yeah, so wonderful.
Would that be all right? That's right
Wonderful.
brain, left brain stuff.
Oh, that would be interesting.
Especially
Okay. Right, so we'll schedule that, but remember to chime in with topics and so forth, because this is our academy, it's not mine. We are enfolded in it.
Great
Okay. And I do thank you. And Sue, can you unmute and make a comment? I think I'm not sure she can, but I'm very glad you're here. And it was wonderful to see all of you. And I'm so sorry about fouling up the beginning.
That's why I got on early.
Do you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Sue, yes.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to say
Good.
something very, current. The comment that you made of finding God in the darkness, and there was a series of shorts for this year's Academy Awards, and a friend of mine likes to rent it, and I really hadn't experienced them before. And you only see sometimes, if you watch these shows, oh, this went to that and this went to that, but to actually see them, and they're very short films. Well, this was a film about a blind and deaf man waiting on a bus, coming from a date, and meeting a troubled youth who decided to assist him and make sure he got home all right on the bus. And he basically just had a sign on him, but in all the darkness, he was able to communicate, and he saw the soul of the boy as being a good man when he had actually stolen from him, and he wound up giving it back. So it was just very interesting, from that Helen Keller kind of point of view, to see, how much there is without certain perceptions. And that's
Yes.
all.
Right.
I
Thank
want to
you.
share that in case you get a chance to see it.
Yes. Right.
Okay, thank you for muting me because I couldn't, and I'm in transit. So I'm going to say good night, or thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Right. Good night. And good night. And I just want to say something about each of you. Alex showed up in my library in Florence, interested in holy women in Florence. Angela was my student in Princeton many years ago. Anne Barbetti and I are working on her book on the John the Baptist embroideries in Florence. Yaroslav Percy is, I think, a friend of Juliana Dresvina. Am I right? No? I don't know your context. And Anya is teaching where I taught and so forth. So we all have these wonderful connections with each other. And Sue is my sort of daughter-in-law. And it's interesting to have these discussions which are going on all over, Colorado, the East Coast, Italy, and so forth. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity, because sometimes I just yearn to have a good conversation about things which are a bit deep and so forth. So thank you. And so shall we say good night?
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bless you,
Nancy.
all of
Thank you,
you.
Julia.
Good night.
Till August.
To Nancy.
Okay, bye-bye.
Right. Now, let's see if I can find. I can terminate. It's not. Yes. Thank you, Nancy.
Have you been vaccinated, Julia? Have you been vaccinated yet?
That's, excuse me.
Have you been vaccinated yet?
Yes, twice. But
Good.
I had to do cortisone because I broke my arm, and so we're not sure the second vaccine will work.
Oh dear.
Yeah, so
Okay.
it's been a bit complicated, right? And you?
Oh, of course. Yeah. Yeah. It was a really very
Right.
great.
Thank you very much, Nancy.
Okay.
Thank
See
you.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
It-